As a young trainee, the Royal Marines training camp at Lympstone, I was taught about the Royal Marines Corps memorable dates: birth of the Corps in 1664, Gibraltar, Bunker Hill in the American War of Independence in 1775, Battle of Trafalgar, Gallipoli, and one in 1918, Zeebrugge. April 1918. 5 ships set off on a one-way mission across the English Channel. Accompanying them are a whole flotilla of Royal Navy ships, including an old cruiser and 2 converted Liverpool ferries. Their decks are packed with soldiers and Marines. Many will not survive the night. Their mission? To storm the mole. A 100 years later, celebrations take place across the UK, commemorating the Zeebrugge Raid. In Deal,
on behalf of Deal Town, you have the freedom of the town. Carry on, please.
and Dover, and London, and in Zeebrugge itself. In 1918, the First World War was drawing to a conclusion. The United States had entered the war in 1917, but their troops were not in Europe in sufficient numbers yet to make a decisive impact.
There was a kind of stalemate. It wouldn't have felt like that on the Western Front, I think, when they had quite significant, hundreds of men were killed every day as an average. But broadly speaking, the seas were ours, and we didn't have the strength to move them away, move them back on land.
The German Navy had not provided a significant threat to the Allies since the Battle of Jutland in 1916. As an island nation, Britain was dependent on supplies brought by shipping across the Atlantic. The losses of shipping had steadily increased through the war until mid-1917 and early 1918, when the losses were reaching unsustainable levels. Larger U-boats were sailing from Germany, but other smaller U-boats were based out of Bruges in Belgium. 2 canals connect Bruges to the sea, a small old one emerging at Ostend, and a modern larger canal which emerged at Zeebrugge. Protection of the English Channel at its narrowest point was the responsibility of the Dover Patrol. In January 1918, command of the Dover Patrol changed to Vice Admiral Sir Roger Keyes. Keyes started an aggressive programme to defeat the U-boat threat. Here at Dover in Kent, there was minefields laid across the channel to Calais. There was nets underwater, and giant searchlights reached out across the channel to force the U-boats to submerge. The British believed one solution would be to block the canal entrances at Zeebrugge and Ostend. Keyes wanted a direct assault on Zeebrugge. His predecessor, Vice Admiral Sir Reginald Bacon, had resisted such a plan, knowing that it could have a huge cost in human life. Keyes later wrote, "Modern war is too costly in life and treasure to prolong the agony by inaction. Thousands of our men were fighting desperately in other areas, and I felt a decision must now be fought for in the area confided to my charge." Keyes planned a raid on the Belgian coast. The plan would carry a terrible risk. The plan would require the blocking ships to pass a gauntlet of German fortifications. The entrance to the Zeebrugge Canal was protected by sandbanks and a mole. This was a 1.5-mile concrete breakwater designed to protect Zeebrugge from severe weather. The mole had a railway connected to the shore by a viaduct. It had buildings and protective shelters for vessels. Searchlights and flares could illuminate anything approaching the mole. The plan was that gunboats would bombard the shore batteries while the RAF attacked Zeebrugge. 3 ships would then come alongside the mole and land a 900-man Royal Navy and Royal Marines assault force who would create a diversionary attack. 2 small submarines would then sail under the viaduct connecting the mole to the shore and explode in place, taking the viaduct with them. Finally, 3 block ships would be sunk in the entrance to the Zeebrugge Canal and 2 in the Ostend Canal. The plan depended on favourable weather conditions. The wind needed to be in the right direction to allow the assault ships to get close to the mole without being destroyed by the German heavy guns. The assault force included a 200-man party of Navy bluejackets who would lead the assault on the mole. The Royal Marines involved were the 4th Battalion Light Infantry. The ship leading the assault would be the Arrogant-class cruiser HMS Vindictive. She was being fitted out at Chatham Dockyard in preparation for the raid. An extra deck was fitted to the port side with ramps to allow troops to assault the mole. Vindictive would be accompanied by 2 requisitioned Liverpool ferries, Iris and Daffodil. 5 obsolete cruisers were chosen as the block ships to be sunk in the canal entrances. Each had 50 tons of concrete on the upper deck to prevent German shipping passing over them at high tide. The preparations were carried out under a shroud of secrecy. The Royal Marines 4th Battalion trained at Deal in Kent. On the 6th of April, the 4th Battalion marched through Deal and embarked on the shipping. Apart from a few officers, they still didn't know their mission. The first attempts at a raid were made on April 11th and then again on April 13th. Both were cancelled because the weather conditions were not favourable. The mission's success depended on the wind being in the right direction to allow the smoke screens to work. Without the smoke, the force would be decimated by the German heavy artillery. Following the cancelled missions in early April, some of the assault force transferred to HMS Dominion. Everybody now had to wait until the next high tide in 10 days' time. The Marines entertained themselves in their way. And the Navy in their way. On 22nd of April, the force set sail again. Conditions were good, but this time the assault would take place under a full moon. The assault force approached the mole undetected, hidden in a smokescreen laid by coastal motorboats. Vindictive led the way. As she closed on the mole, the wind shifted and the ships were sighted by the German batteries on the mole. Star shells went up, turning night into day. The Germans opened fire. At 1 minute past midnight on St. George's Day, Vindictive came alongside the mole. In Dover, at midday, the mayor rings a bell at the town hall to commemorate 100 years and 12 hours since the raid began. Every year, this bell, presented by the King of Belgium after the war, is rung at midday on 23rd of April. As HMS Vindictive approached the mole, she was subjected to a withering fire from the German defences. The ship finally came alongside, most of the crew on the port side already been cut down. The ship was then secured to the mole using giant grappling hooks. One of the actual hooks from Vindictive is here in the Memorial Garden at the Royal Marines Museum in Eastney. Vindictive could not remain stationary against the mole. Dead and wounded covered the assault decks. Vindictive's upper decks were riddled with shrapnel holes. Of the 14 gangways designed to allow the raiders to get onto the mole, all but 2 had been destroyed. One of the Mersey ferries, now renamed HMS Daffodil, came alongside and pushed Vindictive against the mole to hold her in place. Private Alfred Hutchinson was the last Royal Marine survivor of the raid. He was interviewed by BFBS in 1999.
Apart from the bombing and the sinking of the block ships, not many got ashore because it was too rough and they couldn't keep, the boats couldn't keep up against the mole, you see. They kept bouncing away and they couldn't, the ladders to get on the mole were blown away, the majority of them.
On the mole, the Marines and Blue Jackets, heavily laden with grenades and machine gun ammunition, had to descend ladders to get off the mole parapet. Once at ground level, they started to sweep the mole, assaulting German buildings and ships berthed alongside. As the assault continued, a small submarine named C3 headed towards the viaduct connecting the mole to the shore. Her 6-man crew were commanded by Lieutenant Richard Sanford. Sanford wedged the submarine into the viaduct's steel girders. The crew abandoned ship and rowed away. When they were 200 meters away, the submarine exploded. On the mole, Sergeant Harry Wright said, "The explosion was so great the whole concrete mole shook from end to end." Sanford and his crew were picked up by a small picket boat commanded by his brother Francis. Richard Sanford would win a Victoria Cross for this action. Whilst this chaos unfolded, the 3 block ships manned with skeleton crews went in. They were HMS Thetis, Intrepid and Iphigenia. The ships entered the inner harbour and increased to full speed. Thetis came first and ran into the defensive nets strung across the harbour. Unable to move, she was exposed to the full fire of the German guns. Intrepid and Iphigenia came past her unscathed and successfully scuttled themselves in the canal entrance. Their crews evacuated and were picked up by motor launches. The heavily damaged Thetis managed to keep moving and was eventually scuttled outside the canal entrance when she could go no further. Motor launches repeatedly went into the hail of German gunfire to evacuate the ship's crews, who included Australian Navy stokers. On Vindictive, above the bridge, was the foretop gun position, where the Royal Marines artillery were manning pom-pom and Lewis guns. Only one man was left there able to continue with the suppressive fire. Sergeant Norman Finch. On the mole, confusion reigned. Among the assault force demolition parties of Blue Jackets and Marines was Captain Edward Bamford. Both Marines would win Victoria Crosses that night. The Marines and Blue Jackets started to withdraw towards Vindictive. Once they were on board, the ships pulled away from the mole. They again became exposed to the full brunt of the fire of the German guns. On the Mersey ferry Iris, the Marines were told to clear the main deck. They went below. Closely packed below, a German shell exploded amongst them. 50 men died. The battered raiding force headed back to Dover. They had been on the mole for less than 50 minutes. During a 90-minute period, they had lost over 200 men killed and over 350 wounded, with 18 more being taken prisoner. The Germans claimed only 8 of their soldiers were killed. Vindictive arrived back at Dover at 8 a.m. the next morning. It took 3 hours to unload the wounded. Most of them went by an ambulance train to the Royal Naval Hospital at Chatham. After the wounded were taken off, a fleet of lorries took the bodies of the dead to a makeshift mortuary. After Vindictive, HMS Iris arrived to unload over 100 wounded and 77 dead. The remainder of the 4th Battalion returned to their barracks at Deal. Much of the accommodation was empty. The unit had been decimated. In their honour, the Royal Marines would never raise another 4th Battalion. The RAF flew reconnaissance missions over Zeebrugge that day. 2 of the block ships seemed to be blocking the canal. But within 48 hours, German U-boats were able to pass, carefully picking their way between the block ships at high tide. The canal had not been blocked. In Ostend, it was even worse news. The Germans had moved the marker buoys leading to the canal entrance, and the block ships HMS Brilliant and Sirius ran aground before reaching Ostend harbour. The newspapers declared it a great victory. Roger Keyes was given a knighthood. 8 Victoria Crosses were awarded.
I'm here in northwest London, where a memorial stone has been erected for Captain Edward Bamford, one of the 2 Victoria Cross recipients during the Zeebrugge Raid. The other recipient was Sergeant Norman Finch. Unusually, they were awarded the Victoria Cross under the Rule 13 regulation of the Royal Warrant, which allowed a unit to vote for the recipients themselves. Captain Edward Bamford lived until 1928, when he died en route to Hong Kong of pneumonia. Sergeant Norman Finch lived to the ripe old age of 75 and died in 1966.
Although it was hailed as a great victory, many did not feel that way. Captain Herbert Grant, a contemporary of Roger Keyes, said of the raid, "For no such folly was ever devised by fools as such an operation as that of Zeebrugge. For what were the bravest of the brave massacred? Was it glory? For sailors to go on shore and attack forts, which Nelson said no sailor but a lunatic would do."
Tactically, the Zeebrugge Raid was a failure. The attempt to block the lock gates on the Bruges-Zeebrugge Canal failed. The ships didn't get into position. The Germans were moving vessels around the block ships within 48 hours. But operationally and morally, it's a great victory. The British have been right into a heavily fortified German base. They've beaten it up. They've achieved some of the effect they were after. They've demonstrated to the enemy that they're not sitting back waiting to be attacked. They've taken the initiative. They've imposed themselves on the enemy. The future is all going forward.
In World War II, Roger Keyes went on to command combined forces through the inception of the first commando raids. He died shortly after the Second World War and was buried with many of the men killed at Zeebrugge at St James Cemetery in Dover. Alfred Hutchinson died in June 2002, aged 105. The 2 Mersey ferries returned to Liverpool, where they were given the honour of being called Royal Iris and Royal Daffodil by King George. The battered cruiser, HMS Vindictive, was finally sunk in the entrance to the Ostend Canal on May 10, 1918.